You know, I was thinking that for those that may not be so familiar with the story of Joseph recently, we would have to do a little bit of an overview, but that part's been done. And Justice, anytime we need you to teach a class on Torah about the stories of Genesis or beyond, I know you're busy, but that was amazing. That was wonderful. Thank you, and continued success to you and to your entire family and all the good work you do and all the holy work that you do. We are going to get to work over here. We have a fascinating program. We started on time. We end right on time. We have the honey challahs, 8:30 on the dot. You're going to get them. So in the meantime, we have some topics we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about family feuds. We're going to talk about vigilantism and ends justifying the means. And we're going to talk about forgiveness. I'm going to introduce very briefly. You have the introductions in your booklets. It's an honor to have Judge Ellen Koblitz on our panel, served as a judge on many different courts, appellate division for 27 years. Kurt Olender, prominent attorney here in New Jersey, specializing in families and business and all of the heartache that goes along with that. And it's a real privilege to welcome Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, a legendary author and scholar and an ethicist, to our Jewish Law Symposium for the first time. On a personal note, Rabbi Telushkin was a classmate of my mother of blessed memory in high school for 4 years, and it's great to have you here, continuing the friendship from all those years ago. We're going to go right to the video clips, Family Feuds, Joseph and the Brothers. Some of this may be a little familiar if you were paying attention to the words of Justice Wayne Raptor, but we're going to go right to clip number 1 of Joseph and the Brothers having some family feuds.
What makes us mad are the things that Joseph tells us of, the dreams he's often had.
I dreamed that in the fields one day the corn gave me a sign. Your 11 sheaves of corn all turned and bowed to mine. My sheaf was quite a sight to see, a golden sheaf and tall. Yours were green and second-rate, and really rather small.
This is not the kind of thing we brothers like to hear. It seems to us that Joseph and his dreams should disappear.
I dreamed I saw 11 stars, the sun, the moon, and sky. Bowing down before my star, it made me wonder why. Could it be that I was born for higher things than you? A post in someone's government, a ministry or two.
The dreams of our dear brother are the decades big as yours. His talk of stars and golden sheaves is just a load of corn. Not only is he tactless, but he's also rather dear. For there's 11 of us and there's only one of him. The dreams, of course, will not come true. That is, we think they won't come true. That is, we hope they won't come true. What if he's right all along?
Okay. Joseph and the Brothers, obviously not getting along. Kurt Olender, you specialize in handling complex business transactions involving families on all different sides, on all different fronts. Why is it so challenging for families to work together, to be together? What is it? Is it jealousy? Is it anger? Is it just hate? Like what is it about this? Give us a little insight as we start this part of the discussion about family feuds.
So you have to go back to the root of what it is, which is the family. And everyone here has family. And everyone here has history with that family, some good, some bad. And what we see constantly is that whatever the problem is that's existing now usually has its roots in events that took place years, decades, multiple decades earlier. And there are problems that were never solved in the family that then, through the complexity of business and an intense relationship, they come to the surface. In fact, Rabbi and I were talking earlier about exactly how that comes about, and that, when you see a problem arising in a current environment, you have to dig back to not just what the problem is, what I call looking at the rash. You have to go back to what's actually the cause of the symptom you're treating, because it's very rarely what is actually presented to you that's the cause of that's the problem itself. It's something far earlier, like when you look at Joseph in the story, it was his boastfulness, it was him being the favorite of his father, which resulted in jealousy from his siblings. And the number of situations we've had where partners in a business are not getting along that stems from how they were treated as children. It's astounding who got the better presents at the holidays, who was always mom or dad's favorite, the things that never get resolved. And then when you look at business, generally speaking, you spend more time with your partners in business than you do with your family. And when you combine the both, you get a very intense interaction that results in those things coming about. And that's what actually makes them the most difficult to resolve, is because there's an emotional component to the situation. And as lawyers, we always jump straight into, we want to solve the problem. You present a problem, we're going to give you a solution. But you really cannot solve those problems unless you find out what the underlying cause is and really go back in history.
So thank you, Kurt. So Judge, let me ask you, you're on the bench, you have families in front of you, it could be divorce court, it could be chancery, it could be any type of legal matter. You know there's a whole family history. You also know that there's a legal scenario unfolding in the court. Do you separate the two? Do you try to get into who was right in getting the present when they were 5 years old? How do you make legal sense of a scenario that in a way is so emotional and so family-based? If we can move the mics a little closer.
Well, I have to say that I felt when I was in the trial court often, in family court and in chancery, doing probate, for example, or some other family business situation, that I was trying to do a little bit of family therapy, but not very successfully, usually. And I would point out to you, because as a former judge I have to talk about a case, right, is the family saga of the Sipko family, S-I-P-K-O. So in your spare time, if you want to look up, there's 2 Supreme Court cases. I noticed Justice Patterson is here tonight. She might recall this matter. And to say it very briefly, it's the story began in Slovakia, and the family that emigrated to Paterson, New Jersey, twin boys who went to the Paterson public schools. They didn't know a word of English when they came to this country. They were brilliant, both of them, fraternal twins. One went to MIT, the other went to Rutgers. They joined their father in this fabulously successful software company that he had started that provided advice for hedge funds. And they made millions and millions of dollars. The company generated something like $12 million a year. So what went wrong? Why were they in court? What happened is one of the boys, who is now a man, decided he wanted to marry a woman who was not from Slovakia, who was not of his religion, who had been married several times before and had children. And his family essentially disowned him, rejected him. And when his mother passed away, she had tried to disinherit. I say tried because she probably thought she had disinherited her one son. But the son fought back and came to my court, and I was sitting in probate, and I tried the case and found a technical deficiency in the newer will, and we went back to the old one, and she did not succeed in disinheriting this. And here I am on the bench trying to do my family therapy. I say to the father when he testifies, your son has this son, and the son who had the nerve to go off and marry the wrong person, has a baby. You know you will be estranged from this child. And, here's this man who's trying to probably endear himself to the judge who is going to make the decision. There's no jury here. And he said something pleasant. But in fact, as it turned out, I was unsuccessful. So then the business litigation, which I was not the judge, Judge Cantillo was the judge for the business litigation. And that went up to the Supreme Court 2 times. There were 2 opinions, one by Justice Patterson. And I might say also that my current firm, Pashman Stein, represented and probably continues to represent one of the twins, the twin that married the wrong person. And successfully in all this ridiculously elaborate litigation. And to top it all off, because the son who married the wrong person prevailed in the litigation, and the court required the money, millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars, to be handed over. And the father fled the country, pushed money overseas, and the other twin, this is a true story, the other twin is sitting in the Bergen County Jail for contempt of court for not obeying the court's decision. So as I'm thinking about this topic for tonight, I'm thinking this is a quintessential disaster. I don't know, other than this marriage problem, if there was any other estrangement, but I feel like the intensity, the brilliance of these boys, their phenomenal success made them unforgiving, maybe, and not willing to or able to bend. And it is this epic disaster. If anybody wants to write a series, I think it would make a great TV show.
Well, thank you, Judge, for sharing that, and thank you for picking a story of twins from Bulgaria and not anyone whose name is Goldstein or Schwartz. Anything. Thank you. It's just a relief not to have to deal with that. Rabbi Telushkin, we would hope that the story of Joseph is the anomaly in the Bible, that the brothers not getting along is the exception to the norm. Though one could argue that maybe that's not the case. And if you look through Jewish history, there has been this thread of challenges between siblings, between families for a long time. Where does that come from, and why does that happen, and what can we do about it? Give us a little wisdom.
Okay. I'm just curious, for my own curiosity, in how many of your families at the level of first cousin and closer are there relatives not on speaking terms?
Oh, geez.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd say
Probably be easier to have the 3 people raise their hand who all talk to each other.
Right. The truth of the matter, what the rabbi alludes to is shockingly true. In the book of Genesis, the Joseph story at least has somewhat of a happy ending. But think about it. The first 2 brothers in history are Cain and Abel. They can't resolve their problems, and Cain murders Abel, leading to one of the very, very powerful lines in the Bible when God says to Cain, Kol demei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adamah. The blood of your brother cries out to me from the earth. But it's just interesting because the word used for blood is the plural, the bloods of your brother, leading the rabbis to make a very unusual comment. We often distinguish between a single act of murder and obviously mass murder. In the Talmudic view, basically all murder is mass murder because it says not only the blood of your brother, but the blood of all his unborn descendants. So whenever somebody of such an age is killed, look what could have come, or think about, who knows among the people who died in the Holocaust, what might have been achieved. Alan Dershowitz, I'm somewhat friendly with, once told me that he was speaking in Hamburg, Germany, and he said, how many of you here were personally affected by the Holocaust? And relatively few Germans who are alive today were personally affected. He said, how many of you have relatives who have, and then he enumerated a whole bunch of diseases, some of which there have been Jewish doctors who've made massive strides or could have made, and then suddenly they realized, who knows, who knows what we lost. So anyway, so Cain murders Abel, and that story just ends horribly. Abraham has two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. They get separated at an early age because of issues somewhat similar to what you were talking about. They had two different mothers and two different religious traditions, and they unite to bury their father, but that's basically it. Jacob, of course, Isaac then goes on to have two sons, Jacob and Esau. They have a conflict over inheritance, and Jacob gets it in a somewhat deceptive manner. Esau really wants to kill him. They do end up reconciling at a certain point. They sort of bury the hatchet, but then they never see each other again. So somebody once put it, each one remembers where the hatchet was buried, and they just want to stay away from each other. And then finally we have the story of Joseph. And in Joseph's case, the family conflict is terrible because and how many of your families did you feel there was a favored child? My God, this is the most unusual group. Okay. I feel like nobody can raise their hands okay. And how many, now what's interesting is I often, when I'm working with smaller groups, I raise this issue, and then I'll ask, in how many instances, I'll ask it here, in how many instances were you the favorite child? Okay. And how many instances were you not the favorite child? And what I discovered is, in discussion groups, what's pretty obvious is that the people who felt they were not the favorite child were very badly hurt by it and were angry. But I then discovered, and it was fascinating, the people who thought they were the favorite child often were very unhappy about it for two reasons. One is it turned all their siblings against them, which is part of what the problem was with Jacob. And the other, I wouldn't have expected, the other was they often felt that their parents' happiness depended upon their being tremendous successes. So they carried that burden. So the Talmud comments on Jacob's favoritism, and they say, look what happened. For a few selahs, a few dollars worth of silk that he put into this special coat that he made for Joseph, he ignited such animosity among the brothers, and our ancestors ended up getting exiled to Egypt on account of it. So we have to always think in the long-term basis. People too often think short-term, but the long-term implications of what we're doing are often not really thought through of. And so there's a tremendous importance in parents not showing that favoritism. Now, obviously, eventually, and we're going to discuss it later in the issue of forgiveness, Joseph and his brothers do reconcile. But I have a feeling there's one verse in the Bible that's rarely commented upon.
You're the first rabbi in all the years of the Symposium that actually brought a Bible up to the table. So just putting that out there.
Okay. This is a Hebrew-English text, and I'm going to... the brothers never fully trusted that Joseph had forgiven them. Does anybody know why? How we know that? Because...
Don't ask people to raise their hands.
Yeah, right. Okay. No, then I realized this is slightly too large a group to start, doing that. But when Jacob dies, the brothers say to each other, maybe Joseph's going to exact his revenge now. After all, we did a pretty terrible thing to him. And maybe he's just been nice to us because our mutual father is still alive. And so they go to Joseph and they say, Joseph, you should know, before Jacob died, he told us to tell you that you should make sure to forgive us. The Talmud assumes that this was a made-up story. First of all, if Jacob was really afraid that Joseph wouldn't forgive them, he would have instructed Joseph himself. And it's very interesting. I'll just read to you from the Torah text. So Jacob told us to tell you, so shall you say to Joseph, forgive the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. Please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father. And what does the Torah record? And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. I think the reason Joseph was in tears is because he realized after all these years of reconciliation, his brothers were still so scared of him that they had to make up this story. And so that's why it's so important. There was a 19th century American humorist writer, Josh Billings. He said, the important thing to learn about repentance is this: repent of your sins before you commit them.
That's a good quote. Mm-hmm. I need to just interrupt for a moment. The moderators are not supposed to inject themselves into the actual program, but I'm going to take the liberty here to do that because I need to voice a defense for Jacob. The question is obvious. There are 11 boys, and Jacob chooses one and gives him a favorite coat, give him a special coat. What did he think was going to happen? You got 11 boys, you give one a special coat. Of course they're going to hate him. What was Jacob thinking? And the Bible doesn't discuss this. What was he trying to do? He was a parent, and this is kid number 11. I have 9. After a few, you kind of get the hang of it, of how it's supposed to work. Who gives a coat to kid number 11 when the other 10 don't have one? So I think there's a fundamental point here that makes this whole discussion much more complicated. Jacob, not to get into all the details now, had 4 wives. Rachel, his favorite, as was mentioned by Rachel, Rachel passed away in childbirth. So Jacob's the father. He's got 11 boys. 10 of them have a mother. One of them's an orphan. Jacob sees an inequity. One kid doesn't have a mother to go home to every night. The other 11 do. The other 10 do. So Jacob thinks to himself, with the best of intention, what can I do to level the playing field? What can I do to make Joseph feel loved? And that's why he gives him a coat, because a coat provides warmth, and a coat is like a hug, and that's the type of feeling and embrace you get from a mother. So Jacob's intent was not to create a favorite. He was trying to level out something that wasn't fair. And I believe he had the best of intentions in mind, but the best of intentions in mind don't always play out all that well. And that's where, Judge, I'm going to turn back to you for a moment. When it comes to Chancery Court, and when it comes to dealing with estates and all of these things, you see, the cases that work out well never come to you. But I'm sure you see a lot of best of intentions when it comes to dividing assets that just blow up once the loved one passes away. Give us a little insight on that.
Well, for those of you who do this kind of work, I think what I say will be rather old hat. But for everybody else who might, in fact, be thinking about their own estate and their own will, what I would say is that what I saw was that a family that managed to stay together with the passing of a parent, and depending on how the will was constructed, the siblings would be at loggerheads and stop talking and stop socializing because the parent who died left unequal shares to the children, often for not always, but often for very understandable reasons. And it could be that at the time the will was written, one child needed money more than the other, or the parent had already given more money to one child than the other, or one of the children had their own children, and so the feeling was they needed it for the children. But of course, we rarely know when we're going to die, and so you might write a will and not go back to it. Some people write wills, believe me, like every year or two, but others, once it's done, that's it, it's put away, and they never think of it again. So they may hopefully live for many years, and then when they pass away, the reason why they left these unequal shares is no longer valid. The one that had a lot of money lost it, the children grew up, and even if it isn't a large difference, it still can sow so much dissension between the children. And as I told you, I always did this amateur, unsuccessful usually, therapy. And one thing I would say is, like, for the children who are now adults who are feuding, do you know what this is going to do to your children? And the cousins are no longer going to see each other. And this is the last thing that your mother would want or your father would. That's what I would say. But, it didn't always work.
Work.
It did create problems.
Kurt, bring us into the mind of the clients that are dealing with these issues. Tell us how this works in the day-to-day practice of dealing with this mishigas.
So I'm going to give an example of something that's often reoccurring due to two basic principles: transparency and perception. And most of these disputes, especially as Your Honors, you were talking about, a will and estate planning, we deal with this in succession planning with closely held businesses that are owned by families. And what often happens is the parents, or one of the parents that's running the family, doesn't discuss with the family what their intent is, what they're trying to accomplish. Rabbi, as you said, Joseph was given the coat as an act of kindness, not to elevate him above his siblings. And when you don't have transparency, you have misperception. And so one of the things that we do, like we're working on the transition of a large commercial business right now that's owned by the father. The son is second in command, is a minority holder, and there's two sisters who are not in the business. And the family has some means to them. And the father came to me and said, I want to give my son, the majority of the business, and don't worry about the rest of the family. We'll sort it out. And what I said to him, I said, if you are prepared to do this and you want this to survive when you pass, then we need to start with understanding what's important to everyone in the family relative to the rest of your assets. Even though we're only dealing with this one business, if you make this decision today and then ink it, and you don't understand what the rest of your family either perceives that they're entitled to, or what's important to them, or how they may think of their brother, then you will leave behind a mess. And he had never thought about it that way. And he came back, he said, this is a great idea. And so the net result is, before we jump into how to work out the tax and corporate and all the things that you want to do as a lawyer, it starts with the psychological side of it, which is, let's get everybody in a room, talk about what your parents' plans are and how it affects each of you, and get your feedback. Now, I can't say that's going to work for every family.
I was about to say, does that work?
Right.
Does that work?
So, but in the right circumstances, it does. But what you find is that most of these decisions are being made by someone who does not fully contemplate the impact it has on other people in the equation. And so it's just made from their perspective, and that leaves everyone else to perceive what was intended, like Joseph receiving the dream coat.
Let me turn to the rabbi for a moment. Justice Wainer-Apter mentioned the word arev, ki avdecha arav et hanar.
Right.
I made a guarantee. I guaranteed his well-being, that the Jewish people and beyond, we all have an arevut, a responsibility for each other. Throughout Jewish history, throughout the Jewish texts, what is the perceived, or what responsibility do we have, particularly within families, to each other? Are we just happen to be parents of the children of the same parents, or do siblings or family members have a certain responsibility to care for each other for better in good times and in bad times?
First of all, I want to tell you, when Justice, I want to make sure I get your name right, Wainer-Apter When you made that comment about Anochi Arev Li et Hanar, I actually felt like I was living in Messianic times to have a member of the Supreme Court of New Jersey quoting in Hebrew that verse, which not that many Jews are really that familiar with.
Day school education.
Yes, and now but I did disagree with one part of what the justice said. I think Reuben really was a hero. I don't think Judah was. Judah, you could say, well, he wanted to save Joseph's life by selling him into slavery. Think about what Joseph's experience was. He leaves the house one morning. It was the experience that happened actually to many black Africans in the past. They leave their house one morning and they're kidnapped and they never see anybody again. And so, I think the meaning of the end of the story is when Judah then is willing to become a slave instead of Benjamin, that's what shows his real transformation. And I think that was so important. But it's an interesting thing also. I just want to comment for a minute on something that was said. I remember years ago reading a book that actually was in New Jersey, Philip Roth wrote, called Patrimony. And he writes in the book that at a certain point, his father had said, he had told him about his will, and he was exactly dividing it between his two sons, which I think most of us think that's probably the smart thing to do. And Philip Roth said, he was doing financially much better than his brother. He said, Dad, leave it, I don't remember what his brother's name was, leave it to so-and-so. And then his father died, and it turned out his father really had done it. And then Philip Roth writes, and I was really unhappy that he had done it. So I think it's very hard to separate the feeling that money in that situation or the parents' possessions does represent at a certain level love. So if he wanted to go ahead and then give it to his brother, that's fine, but there was something symbolic in distinguishing, between them in that way. Technically, strangely enough, we are not halachically, as you know, it's a common Jewish tradition, you should give 10% of your earnings to tzedakah and to charity. And actually, the first people who have the right to receive charity, if they need it, is your members of your family. People do not necessarily know that. And
charity starts at home.
Yes, right. So they're the first ones to do it. I mean, there's a famous instance where a man came to Chaim Soloveitchik, who was the great Talmudic scholar of his time, and said, my father lives at a very great distance. I don't think I'm financially responsible for having to pay to go travel to see him. So Chaim Brisker said to him, yeah, you're right, walk. But I think, look, the point is taking care of your family really would be your first responsibility. Your immediate responsibility is obviously your spouse and children, but then your brothers and sisters have the first claim on you.
Thank you. I want to wrap up this segment with one more little piece. Families in business, when you're representing, an attorney's representing a family, been representing them for years. Now there's a divorce in the family, and the family attorney wants to represent one of the sides in the divorce, Judge Koblitz. Does this ever happen?
Yeah, it does happen. And I think, I'm aware that it's easy for me to say drop representation of a client, but if that's a client who really wants you to represent them and you've been representing them for a long time and it's lucrative, it's not so easy. But nonetheless, I think you should think long and hard before continuing in litigation after you've represented both sides. And this can happen if a lawyer draws up a will for a couple and then there's a dispute and one of them passes away, there's a dispute. There's a lot of ways to get into trouble and to have divided loyalties, which of course a lawyer is not permitted to do. So I would say that, it's always wiser to err on the safe side
Kurt.
in those situations.
Yeah, let me add a little something to this. So you have a family business. Let's make three shareholders. They're all equal. You've been engaged by the corporation. Your engagement letter is with the corporation. You've represented them for years, and you've made relationships with all three of them in various capacities. And then that inevitable day comes when they want to get rid of one of the other ones for whatever reason. And you're called upon to then say, well, you're called upon to tell them what to do. They say, how do the two of us get rid of the other one? And, there's a couple basic principles you have to follow. First is there's ownership of a corporation, and then there's operation of a corporation. And so companies are not run by their owners unless the owners are officers or directors in the company. In a family business, you actually do get both scenarios. You get the business that was inherited and some of the siblings are not involved in it at all, and the others where they all are. If you're dealing with a corporation where the person who's being thrown out is one of the people who are running it, you're going to find yourself having to tell everyone to find independent counsel and that you represent the company. You can tell each of them what the shareholder agreement says, what the rights are under the law, but you cannot guide them on how to toss out the other one. Where that deviates is where the interest of the corporation and the people who are running it, who are the controlling owners, then it shifts where you are representing common interest and not the third person. But that is probably one of the most frequent things that comes up in these family disputes in family-owned businesses, is that there literally always comes a time where there's a disagreement and one of them calls you and says, how do I do X to this one? And you've really got to take a step back and focus on who you represent, who controls it and owns it, and then guide yourself accordingly.
Okay, Rabbi.
I just want to direct a question to the two of you that just occurred to me as you were speaking. Wouldn't you have to excuse yourself? Because since you had represented all three of them at some point, you were told things in confidence by the person who, let's say, they want to throw out now. So to use what you have been told in confidence to represent the interests of the other two, wouldn't that be an automatic conflict of interest?
If the third person was not involved with the company,
Oh, okay.
then but if all three are involved, you're absolutely correct, which is why you are then company counsel, and they have to get independent counsel. And frankly, if you can no longer serve as company counsel because they cannot agree as operators how you're to provide advice, then you just resign and say everyone get their own counsel, and they're on their own.
Rabbi, does this concept exist in either synagogue life or in Jewish historical context of, congregants coming before a rabbi or a beit din or some sort of rabbinic tribunal, and they're all local people, and there are relationships involved, there may be financial interest, there may be kosher certification, who knows, the rabbis has all sorts of, then the rabbi's asked to mediate some level of dispute. Do rabbis have the ability to punt and say, find independent rabbinic counsel, I'm not getting involved in this, or does that not exist as much?
I think, no, the concept really would exist. There is a notion of conflict of interest. We know the term in Hebrew is nogea b'davar, one who has an interest in the matter at hand. And I'll tell you where it comes up often it comes up actually fairly often in my life, not exactly in the scenario you're describing because I'm not involved in business in that way, but when somebody asks me for advice, if I have any interest in their coming to one conclusion or another, you are obligated to tell the person. I mean, it came up within the last couple of weeks. We had hired a woman from Israel who was going to be an au pair for us, and she came over and just started missing Israel so desperately. And she wasn't happy with the graduate program she'd studied here. And she said, what should I do? What should I do? So I said, listen, we need you here as an au pair. I can't give you fully honest advice. And because it really seemed to me her own interest was in going back. And, you come across that. So this, by the way, well, first of all, you're all lawyers here, basically. So the scenario you're describing is more likely to come to you. But I'm telling you, in any instance where you're asked to give advice, you have to really analyze, do I have any interest in their going in a certain direction? And you have to own that up front. You can then go on to give advice, but you have to at least make them aware that you can't be fully objective.
So if someone were to say, Rabbi, what would be a good book to buy for a bat mitzvah girl? You'd have to, you'd have to say.
I'd have to quote other people.
You'd have to recuse yourself. Okay, we're going to.
No, I'd be in luck. I would quote Justice Warner Apter, who said, ask her.